I'm Henri Logan. I have the privilege of chairing the ILR board, and I'm so pleased to be able to talk with you about our today's presentation. Many of you know that we have had an extraordinary series of lectures on AI. And Pushpa is here, and she's done an amazing job of organizing the 6th session, but then we've had little bits of AI throughout the curriculum this entire term. And this one is a 2-part series that many of you know, begins with our speaker today, and then we have a bus to UF, to the College of Journalism and Communications, where we'll have a chance to actually see students using this extraordinary teaching technique. Let me start out by saying that Nathan J. Carpenter is the inaugural director of the Atlas Lab, a social media listening and analytics lab in the College of Journalism and Communication at the University of Florida. He manages the lab's operations by facilitating research, instruction, immersion opportunities, and external partnerships around social media listening and analytics. He also provides thought leadership for social media data collection and strategy development for academic and professional communities. He has contributed to recent scholarship on social media published in the journals Heart and Lung, Communication and the Public Self and Identity, and Cultural Studies. He has also recently contributed a chapter on analytics and measurement to the book Public Relations and Strategic Communications, and is co-author of the textbook Social Media Research Methods. Since joining UF in 2023, Nathan has brought more than 1,300 students into the Atlas Lab and provided them with hands-on training in social media research and analysis techniques through more than 70 class visits, 30 workshops, and live events. He has directed Atlas Lab resources in support of data collection and analysis for more than 50 scholarly and industry research projects for faculty, grad students, and centers from across the university. Prior to joining UF, he served as the director of Convergent Media for the School of Communication at Illinois State, where he created and coordinated the Social Media Analytics Command Center from 2014 through 2023. Nathan holds a PhD in Rhetoric, Theory, and Culture, and a Master of Science in Rhetoric and Technical Communication, both from Michigan Technology University. We are so pleased to have you, Nathan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear okay on this one? Yep, okay, you can all hear me okay? There we go, okay, wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me today. It's a little unusual for me to come out of the lab, but I'm so glad that you all get to come visit the lab for our next session as well. But just want to highlight, this is just a corner of the lab, and it's a space that contains 45 screens that compose all these video walls that allow us to do very large-scale demonstrations of the types of analytics and data collection that we can do. But I'd like to actually begin with a little bit of a thought exercise. So put on your imagination caps here a moment. And imagine the last time you were at a wedding or a banquet or just a very large gathering with lots of seats and tables, maybe people sitting around and talking. And let's say you're at a wedding like this, and the mother of the bride comes up to you and says, I want you to figure out what everybody's feeling about this wedding. I want you to get a sense of what they thought of the bride's dress, what they thought of the ceremony, what they thought of the food at the reception, the cake, all of that. And now can you imagine going through that process, what you might do, right? And if you're me, I might do something very classic like eavesdrop, right? Like kind of cross my arms, go from table to table, and listen in on some of the conversation. I might directly ask people as well. I might ask other people if they've heard anything anyone else, right? But that whole process is very, very complicated. It's not something that you would be able to do in a timely manner, let alone listen to everybody in one space. Right? Now let's complicate that a little bit. Imagine you're asked by local officials within your home county, can you listen in on conversations that everybody's having about a rising pandemic and their concerns related to a pandemic? There's no way you can sit in on all those conversations, right? One of the things you could do, though, is try to find available public conversations. And so what you're looking at right here is a visualization. There are several of these altogether, but I'm focusing on the one on the left here. A visualization of McLean County, Illinois, and all of the public social media accounts that were talking about the rise of COVID over the course of 3 months. And we were able to map relationships. We were able to study attitudes and opinions. We were able to start to pull out concerns that the larger community was having. Everywhere from people claiming that it was a hoax, to people who were trying to find supplies, to people caring for loved ones who had fallen ill. And that representation, though, was a good example of what we call larger scale social media listening or analytics. And if you think about what we have available to us right now, we go from, again, a wedding where people are in person talking and you're trying to listen in, to a smaller community, and now potentially to the world where we are constantly producing data. This is a graphic produced by a company called Domo, and every year they release a new infographic just talking about the overwhelming amounts of data that we create through our social media applications, through our online services, through different sites that we might visit on a regular basis. And they basically tell us what happens every minute of every day. So some pretty startling numbers, like 3.4 million YouTube views happen every minute. People create 251 million emails every minute, right? TikTok users upload 16,000 videos every minute, right? And now think about the compounding amounts of data that then produces over the course of a year, or 5 years, or eventually 10 years. And that is an immense amount of data. And many of those data, in many cases, are public. In other words, we can all see those conversations. Now, if we go back to that wedding metaphor, right, it's very difficult to go from table to hear everyone on your own. But when you have access to some very, very high-powered computing, and when you have very good relationships with social media companies and data service providers, you can actually listen to every single one of those conversations that's happening. And that's in essence what we are attempting to do in the Atlas Lab here at the University of Florida. And so, in short, this is what this lab space does. We analyze user-generated data to help understand social dynamics that shape the digital media landscape. In other words, it feels like we have one of the biggest ears or sets of eyes, depending on how you think about it, as a window into all of those conversations that are happening in social media. All of those posts, all of those stories being told, we have the ability to potentially gather those and analyze those in ways that helps us understand the world. Now, people often ask, where are these sources of data coming from? And so really broadly, these will change from time to time, and depending on the tool that we're using, there'll be many different sources. But largely, we're examining public social media posts. And I want to highlight the public part there. That's very important. We're not breaking into your personal phones. We're not trying to break into your devices and read things we shouldn't. These are things that are posted publicly. We're looking for comments. We're looking at forums. We're reading through video and podcast transcripts. We're listening to online news. We're looking at blogs. We're gathering posts from all of these different spaces. And we're basically analyzing those in ways that help us make sense of the world. So I often use the terms social media listening and analytics interchangeably, which I shouldn't. But basically, listening is a three-part process here. And analytics are really the metrics and the techniques that we use in order to unpack insights. But basically, when we think about listening and why we do it, here's what's going on. So one, we're observing feedback and comments and questions and inquiries all across the social web or in online news or in other spaces where people are creating content. And we're doing that in order to capitalize on emerging and innovative opportunities. So again, think back to that wedding. If the mother of the bride says, what did everybody think of the dress, right? In this case, I don't even have to ask. I can go looking for every single post where people have put out an opinion in that case, right? And I'm thinking about looking for opportunities. What other feelings did they have? What else did they talk about that the mother-in-law of this wedding isn't even bringing up, right? The second thing that we're doing is as we're doing that observation and data collection, we're now evaluating several different things, including what we call sentiment, which I'll talk about shortly here as well, and patterns that help us understand the current state of dynamics within a community. So in other words, we're really looking for patterns across these very, very large data sets. And then third, we're using all of this data that we can collect in a number of ways. And one of those that is really important, especially for the students that I work with, is that they are using these data to spark ideas and creative executions for communication strategy. In other words, we're not doing this just for the fun of it, although I'm lucky in that my office is right in the lab, so I can do it for the fun of it if I want. But mostly we're doing this for research, or we're doing this to inform industry and strategy. Now, in terms of the process, again, we're thinking about these massive amounts of data coming from public social media and online news and forums. Really, it's a three-step process that's quite straightforward. One is that we capture content. In other words, we have to go out and find the posts that we're going to study. And that happens through a number of ways. We maintain relationships and subscriptions with companies that do most of that work for us. But from time to time, we also train students in directly querying data from those platforms themselves. So they'll learn to write code, or they'll learn other types of strategies for actually copying and collecting those data directly. The next process is understanding those data, and we'll look at some examples of that in action. But really what we need to do is go through and remove the noise. Because as you can imagine, if you're in a wedding banquet hall with 200 people seated at tables, those conversations are loud. Now imagine that with 10 million people and all the noise that would occur across, again, not conversations, but all the text, all of the other conversations and noise and discussions that are happening. So we do have to do some cleaning. And then we get to do the advanced analytics. We actually get to go in and start to understand what are the emotions, what are the topics, what are the relationships among everyone having conversations within these spaces. And then finally, we work on presenting the data. Because once we learn from those data, it doesn't do any good unless we actually put those into digestible reports, or that we do what we'll do today and talk through some of the analyses that we've actually produced. So we have to present those findings, and especially to researchers or stakeholders for whom being able to distill those millions of voices and posts into actionable insights truly matters. Now, I do want to say that this is nothing new. I think about the only thing that's new about this is the scope and scale and the fact that most of this is user-generated. So those of us that do work in public relations, especially when we teach, will often go back to 1903 as kind of one of our charter dates that we'll study, because this was essentially the time frame in which AT&T first began doing large-scale media monitoring. And this one actually is kind of close to my heart. One, my grandfather was a telephone man. He ran lines in the 1930s through the 50s. And so he was a telephone person. But the other reason it hits close to home for me is I first got a lot of my professional chops working for the Adler Planetarium in Chicago. And we subscribed to a service that did exactly this. AT&T worked with a publicity bureau in Boston to basically go through the major newspapers of the day, find any discussion of AT&T, they would clip those out, they'd send them to a main office, and those people would go through and categorize, saying, this is good publicity for AT&T, this is bad publicity, here's an opportunity, here's an editor we don't like, right? And they would start to organize that. And then in the end, they'd take all those clippings and devise a strategy to change public opinion about the company. And they were incredibly effective. A lot of the studies look at between 1903 and through the late 1920s, and they basically said AT&T created kind of the first ecosystem where they could change policy and coverage of their company because they were so tuned into the media ecosystem. And nowadays, this is much more of what this looks like. In fact, this is a good representation of the shift into social media listening and monitoring, as opposed to, again, relying solely on newspapers. And so in the late early 2000s and early 2010s, companies like Gatorade, which this really hits home to me now that I've arrived at the University of Florida, and Gatorade is one of the models that we used to look at all the time. But they created something called Mission Control, where they worked with some software developers and social media platforms to create this space where they would basically study and follow all the conversations related to Gatorade, sports, hydration, just general athletics, but maybe teams and sponsorships. And they used that to be able to react in real time. And so they were able to do things like identify corporate crises, they were able to identify opportunities, but really a really innovative space. And again, taking that same model that AT&T developed in the early 1900s to monitor news coverage, and now expanding that scope to what all of us might be posting in online spaces. And when we think about the techniques, so what goes into this process, I'll walk you through 5 ways that we do this work, which include trend analysis, something we call sentiment analysis or opinion mining, social network analysis, visual analytics, and then putting it all together, we'll often take those data and do work in segmentation. In other words, splicing that in different ways that helps us answer different levels of questions. So first, in terms of trend analysis, what we're doing in this case, again, we are writing a search query, and we're saying, hey, software, go out and find all of the potential posts that use a particular keyword or set of keywords or other variables, and collect those posts. So the case that I use that we've been doing a lot with students lately is on Billy Napier. Very interesting story for students, and has been now for several years. And so if we do a search for phrases related to Billy Napier, often what we're then doing next is looking for patterns within all of those posts. So again, imagine tens of thousands of tweets, public Facebook posts, Instagram posts, blog posts, news stories, right? And what that is then doing, the natural language processing, is going through and looking for things like names or phrases or objects, brands, organizations that have already been identified. And artificial intelligence can really aid in this process by creating summaries and visualizations of those terms. So what you're seeing right here is just we call these word clouds. You've probably seen these in certain contexts. And really just the most frequently used terms that were also being used with Billy Napier. And they help us basically get a sense of where this conversation could be going next. Now, here's an interesting visualization. Don't worry about what any of the words mean. But now imagine, again, that dining hall or banquet analogy at the beginning, right? Now think about being able to visualize that based on all of those posts that we've discovered, right? Conversations where people are talking about Billy Napier in many different contexts. And what AI helps us do with one of the software platforms that we work with is that it can do what we call conversation clustering. In other words, it can gather posts that are things like replies or comments or otherwise people engaging with each other, and then it looks for what is the topic of conversation. And then it draws these lines among those, and then it goes through and actually helps us determine that overall topic. And so the color coding shows us the different topics available. So things like the game against Texas A&M, or Florida Gators fans showing some sort of support, or just overall injury updates, or things like that. So we can see all of these different conversations in one space. So AI is really assistive in that process of mapping that for us, and helping us kind of understand, again, what might be said within these different groups and communities. The other thing that AI helps us do in this process of thematic analysis is GPT summary. In other words, so what you're seeing on screen right here is a measure of when, on a timeline, we're seeing all these posts about Billy Napier. And the software that we work with allows us to identify some of those moments. And so what I did is I highlighted 16,000 posts right there that you can see in that pop-out box. And it will actually go through and then summarize the most relevant content for us. So in other words, it will say, what are the dominant reoccurring themes that we see happening over and over and over again? And then it will provide those in a neat summary that allows us to make some insights. So in this case, we're seeing things like criticism of Billy Napier's performance, specific on flaws in different games, calls to action, including fire Billy Napier, which I guess that happened already now, but that was happening early throughout the season. And then we were even seeing things like historical context. So people were looking at other moments, talking about other moments that were potentially problematic, or making comparisons to other coaches. And that's something, imagine going from 16,000 posts, which would take you probably a couple days to read through, let alone categorize, now down to a few seconds. Right? That's an immense amount of time saved for many of our students. Now, the downside, though, of course, is that it's not covering every single potential topic, right? And so we have to find other ways to go through and maybe take this as a starting place and to say, okay, let's focus only on criticism, or let's focus only on praise, and then further divide, right? But it's a great place to begin, and for many students, this is very helpful for the research process. The second thing that I mentioned was sentiment analysis. And this is fairly interesting in terms of trying to determine what is the tone of conversation. And so essentially what's happening is we're using natural language processing to determine whether a post has a particular valence. In other words, does it appear to be expressing positive or negative emotions? The second thing that we can do is go through each post and in many cases estimate the types of emotions that are conveyed, whether they're anger, fear, joy, surprise, sadness, anticipation, disgust, or trust are many of those categories. And this all happens through a process of pre-training. In fact, we don't have to do much of that. The tools that we work with have been trained already to adapt to and identify either those emotions or the valence. And when we're looking at the story of Billy Napier, a really good example of that as well, we can see that on a timeline with that net sentiment over time. So if we go back into July and August, people were pretty optimistic about the season, right? And we can see a sudden shift after, I think it was the USF game, where now we have people talking much more negatively, on average, or at least the ratio is off there. And relatedly, when we then do different types of thematic analysis, we can also identify then terms that are related to those positive or negative feelings. And so we can see different words in there, things like play calling, field goals, loss, so all those terms emerging that help us basically get a sense of why people are feeling the way they are. Now, another area that's fairly interesting is called social network analysis. And this is actually adapted from other areas of both social science and mathematics. But what we find really interesting for social media analytics and social media analysis is that we're able to do visualizations of either relationships or behaviors that occur across very large networks. And what's also very helpful for us is that we can measure the importance of actors within that network purely based on their connections, right? And so we're able to really kind of mathematically define who matters. Kind of independent of what they say or what they post, we can look at their position within a network. And so this thing over here that looks like, I don't know, a ball of yarn gone wild is probably the best way to describe that, is an example of something I've helped some of our graduate students working on this past semester. They are doing a study on Nigerian elections. And so these students are all from Nigeria. And they're particularly interested in the Nigerian diaspora. So in other words, people who have moved away but are still talking about the elections there. And so what they wanted to see were which countries may have had or had some sort of influence on that conversation of the elections themselves. And so what we started to look for, and you can see the lines are different color codes, and all throughout this is a very high order view. But we can see the names of accounts that are getting reposted. And some of those were very interesting to our students because they were being reposted by people in the United States, yet they were accounts that were in Nigeria that were talking about very, very specific items that people posting from Germany weren't connecting with at all. And so was there a language barrier? Was there a political barrier as well? Were more American members of the diaspora concerned with one candidate over another? But anyway, they were able to map out a lot of layers of influence. And that process, again, is something that can really help us measure who matters in these cases. And then we have visual analytics. And I'll go through this really briefly, but just consider the idea that AI is incredibly beneficial at examining any images that we discover within social media posts. And it can do several things. One is just recognize contents within an image. And so on the right-hand side, this is a quick example of one of the tools that we use. If we did a search for Florida football or Billy Napier, it returns back, here are all the things identified across all of those images. In other words, 87% of the posts contained a person. No surprise there. But then it looks for other things too. So neckties, so no surprise, like if you're doing a post-game conference, usually a coach or a reporter is wearing a tie somewhere in there. Cell phones, footballs, helmets, tables, glasses. And if you're thinking about, again, students doing very particular work, right, they're thinking about what images matter and why. What's within these images that can have an effect potentially on people's perceptions of what's happening. The other thing that visual analytics can do is identify what we call entities. In other words, it will look for things like logos or name brands or other things associated with very specific organizations. And so, again, in a search for Billy Napier, no surprise that we see Florida Gators or the Nike swoosh. I think almost every shirt he has one of those on there. But other ones show up that are always kind of interesting, like why is SpongeBob showing up? And students actually investigate that, and they figured it out is that many people were sharing memes that contained SpongeBob in them, right? And to talk about their frustrations with the game, I think it was. And then we see other teams mentioned as well. We see corporate sponsors like Allstate. There were a lot of TikTok videos that were being shared, and so hence the TikTok watermark. But again, for students doing this work, this is a very helpful way of not only reading text, but then also being able to read what's happening within an image in a very quick manner. And then finally, with everything that we've just done, we also do a wide variety of what we call segmentation, which is just basically sorting, grouping, and filtering data. So if we think back to that wedding banquet category, right? If I was asked to do that by the mother of the bride, I might say, well, do you want me to focus on the aunts and uncles? Do you want me to focus on the cousins? Do you want me to focus on the siblings table, right? And so that's basically a way of thinking about what we're doing here as well. As we're collecting data, we're also thinking about, does it matter where the location is? So interestingly enough, right now, I have students who are very interested in the hurricane that has now hit Jamaica. And in fact, we can create searches that look for only content coming from Jamaica. We can find people in the moment posting about their status during the hurricane there. We can sort by different layers of demographics. So many social media platforms allow people to input their birthdays, and so we can derive their age from information like that. We can sort by things like follower counts, so people who are more influential than others based on the number of followers they have. User descriptions. There are just many ways that we can do that slicing and dicing that can help us in the long run determine the content of the data. Now, in terms of what we're using to do this work, it's often really helpful to talk about two layers. So on the left, we have what we call software as a service. And these are companies that have been established to essentially exclusively deal with acquiring and analyzing social media data. Right now in the Atlas Lab, we work with 4 of those that include TalkWalker, BrandWatch, Quid, and Open Measures. And the reason that we use 4 of them is, one, we were able to get a grant, basically, to help us explore these and to look at ways that we could use these in teaching. And so we were really fortunate in that capacity to really try these out in different scenarios and different settings for students. On the right-hand side, we also try to focus on tools that are either free or open source. And so some of those include some fundamentals such as Google Trends. In fact, in addition to social media posts, we spend a lot of time looking at search. So I don't know if you know this, but anytime you complete a search in Google, Google is indexing all of that you do and provides a website that you can actually explore that shows you those search queries and indices. It doesn't show who's creating them, but it gathers data on where they're from, how popular that search is in relation to others. And that's a data that Google makes widely available. And in fact, tomorrow I'm training a group of students on using that for reporting. Additionally, we do a lot of work with what's called the Meta Ads Library. And so right there in the center with the woman with the laptop. And basically what that is it's a repository of all of the political and social issues ads that have been created and put out into Facebook and Instagram. And we can explore that database and derive information about it, including who's creating different kinds of political ads, who they're targeting, and then we can also obtain all the text and other metadata and analyze those to basically reconstruct whatever political strategy is being put into place. And then finally, there's a dark screen down there on the bottom, and I mentioned that sometimes we go directly to social media platforms and work directly with their what's called an API, which stands for Application Programming Interface. And so we can train them to work with Reddit, and Blue Sky is a new emergent platform right now, and teach students how to directly ask for data from those platforms and do their own analytics work using code. And so those are really the 2 areas that we're working within. The upside of the tools of the trade is that it's very easy access. In fact, those of you who will be coming to the Atlas Lab, we're going to teach you a little bit of doing that. If you bring your own laptop or your own tablet, we'll be able to give you access and learn how to work with all the dashboards and create different queries. But the downside is that we have to go obtain grants to basically fund those. They're not inexpensive by any means. And of course, the free and open source, we really enjoy teaching with those because students can then use them anywhere. And it doesn't take us much to work with those. The downside, of course, is that we have to teach students to code. There's an extra layer of work that has to emerge. Now, I do want to take a moment, now that we kind of walked through some of the things that happen when we do social media listening, and talk about the rise of what we call academic social media labs. So University of Florida is by no means the first to be doing this work. In fact, I started a lab at Illinois State in 2013. So I've been now doing this for, goodness, 12 years. So it's been kind of a long journey. And other institutions like Clemson, USC, University of Georgia, University of Tennessee, all have social media labs where they're doing this type of work. But when I was asked to come to University of Florida in 2023, really this is what I was asked to do that makes it a bit more distinctive, right? So one, our dean, Hubert Brown, really invited me to come to University of Florida to start to create a culture of data and information literacy among our students. So if you know anything about communication students, they got into communication because they don't like math, right? Right? Public relations, advertising, mass media students, journalism students, and then they always get surprised because we have classes on things like data journalism, or we have a lab like the Atlas Lab where we're collecting huge volumes of data and teaching them how to apply some basic statistics to understanding those. And so I think the good news is we're starting to create something of that culture. And I'll provide some examples of how that's happening. The second thing that we're doing, though, is providing a space that provides high-quality experiential learning. So in other words, we are putting students into projects and topics where they have to make sense of data on behalf of stories that they're writing, on behalf of clients that we work with, on behalf of research faculty who don't know how to use these tools or who don't have time to learn to use the tools, but have needs and can direct research that students can then assist with. And the third thing that we're doing is increasing research productivity. Since I got here, some really earth-shattering things happened within the social media environment. The first one is that Elon Musk took over Twitter. He renamed it X, and for years, and we're talking going back to almost the beginning of Twitter, especially social science researchers and media scholars have been using Twitter. We've called it the fruit fly of media studies because it's allowed us to do so many different types of studies. And Elon Musk essentially cut off that access and began to charge exorbitant fees to even be able to access them, somewhere in the range of $6,000 a month to access what is a fraction of what we could get before. So that's been incredibly problematic. So having our lab has basically allowed us to circumvent some of that damage because many of the platforms that we work with allow us insights into Twitter. We pay that subscription. We're allowed to see, again, those very deep insights. We're able to collect 1 million posts about the Florida Gators, and it's not a problem. We're able to do that work and pay much less than what we would pay Elon Musk to get direct access. So that's a big deal. But the other issue that we've seen, too, is that Mark Zuckerberg, who's the owner of Facebook and Instagram, has increasingly made it difficult for us to access Facebook and Instagram data. And there used to be a tool called CrowdTangle that allowed us to query Facebook and Instagram and other platforms that used to be related to Facebook. And he also cut off access to that as well. And so, again, our ability to maintain access to some of these more industry tools, the software as a service tool, allows us now the ability to make queries and in some cases download data that our researchers can use again. So we're attempting to fill that gap. We're attempting to provide that access that people have lost. And then finally, just by having a space like this where we really promote, in particular, student engagement, is elevating the overall profile of the College of Journalism and Communications. It's highly visible. We have members of the public here who are kind of seeing the space. You're seeing that we're doing very new and innovative things. And that's also helping us at the national level as well. We recently received high marks in our reaccreditation process because we're providing additional opportunities and supplementing already excellent work with the ability to now go out into the larger social web and continue to do research. Now, here's some examples of recent projects. If you're wondering, okay, how do all of these matter, right? Why does it matter that we can go out and listen to huge volumes of data and try to make sense of them? So here's a project that we recently did with the Center for Public Interest Communications. They were working with ADT, who's a home security company, was a very large client of theirs, and they were doing what we call a narrative change project. In other words, ADT wanted to know, how do we rethink concepts of security, and how do we rebrand around something that doesn't sound like police and surveillance all the time? And so they were really interested in the idea of what it means to have a peace of mind, right? Not giving someone a piece of your mind, right? Rather, what does it mean to have, again, that sense of calmness or wholeness or whatever that might mean? And they wanted to understand that in the context of daily life. And so what we did as part of that project, now the Center for Public Interest Communications did very classic social science methodologies, interviews, focus groups, literature review. They went out and did all sorts of other things, but they invited our lab into this project to go out into the social web, and we identified 2 million public social media posts that used that phrase, peace of mind. And again, we used everything that we just covered in terms of thematic analysis, social network analysis, sentiment analysis to begin to determine what's happening, right? And so we had a couple of really interesting discoveries. So one is that we saw a couple of distinctive features when we looked at like the American West versus the Midwest versus the South and the Northeast. And while almost everyone that we found data from in those different regions talked about self-care being one of those top features, we also saw that things like religion came out more importantly in the Midwest, that having money and good health care came out more predominantly in the South, that having access to health care and kind of a fulfilling life with lots of complexity was something people talked about in the Northeast. And again, we did that by analyzing 2 million different posts from across the social web. The other thing that we did, because we can do some really deep segmentation, is that we were able to go by different generational cohorts. And so we looked for that phrase, peace of mind, and we broke it down by Gen X, millennials, Gen Y, and I think we also did baby boomers as well. As we went through, we found, again, major differences. So I'll just read you the excerpt here a little bit. So when we looked at them, baby boomers on X and Twitter, when they posted, they talked about peace of mind within the context of faith, politics, religion, culture, and music. Right? When we looked at Gen Xers and millennials, there were some common themes. They saw the context of financial stability and security as the things that would give them a peace of mind. But then we saw some differences there too. Gen X was focused much more on mental health, whereas millennials were concerned with finding ways to be more self-reliant. And then finally, when we looked at Gen Z cohorts, again, by going through and segmenting these 2 million posts and pulling out those that we knew were within a particular age range, we learned that they emphasized personal relationships. Almost every time we found data, they were talking about personal relationships, setting boundaries, avoiding drama, leaving toxic relationships. Right? And so that really helped this study overall begin to ask new questions that they hadn't anticipated in the interviews and focus groups that they were already raising. So again, one example of why this kind of work can matter. Here's a second one that we did in an entirely different context. This was for the Heart and Lung Journal, and this was with colleagues that I had both here at UF as well as back at Illinois State University. And this was among nursing faculty. And they were very concerned with health information and how people are talking about heart attack symptoms in online spaces. And as we know right now, like health communication is full of misinformation, whether it's deliberate or accidental. It's a space where people share information that may not always be 100% medically accurate. And so what we did is went through and found tens of thousands of posts that indicated some form of heart attack symptom. And we looked at, I think it was a full year between 2021 and 2022. And it took us about a year to actually work with those data and process those data. And so this was a project that I took with me from Illinois State, brought here to Florida, and brought some other faculty in to help us with that process. And we began to boil those down to kind of their most fundamental themes and patterns. And one of the things that we really were also interested in is what are the symptoms that people wrote about in a co-occurring way. So in other words, sometimes people will say chest pain, but then they'll also say shortness of breath, right? And if they say those two things together, we want to map those out. And so we produced a map just looking for the most commonly co-occurring symptoms. We produced some other maps that looked at most commonly occurring misinformation. And then the highlights really were that we found that gender was definitely a strong component, a major focus on women's symptoms, pardon my language here. So major focus on women's symptoms. And then we also found that nearly 1 in 5, because again, our group was primarily nursing faculty, discovered that 1 in 5 posts conveyed misinformation. And again, the only way that we could do that work is by the ability to go through and discover themes via artificial intelligence and different patterns of natural language processing. And then in the end, we did some network analyses here to look at co-occurring relationships among symptoms that were reported. Now, here's some projects that we have in progress right now in terms of work that we're bringing students into or faculty into in different ways. So one is, right now, you've probably read the news, is that there are potentially changes to Florida's vaccine mandate in schools that are coming through. We have journalism faculty members who are very interested in how that story is being framed. In other words, what are the headlines being used? Who are the main characters within these stories? Who's being blamed or who's being lauded in different situations? And so, and the best way for us to do that, of course, is by going into social media. So one, we can see the news stories themselves, but then we can see how the public is working with those in different ways. And further, we can segment that, right? We can actually go through and identify people who claim to be medical professionals, people who claim to be teachers, people who are policy makers, people who are parents, right? And we can begin to determine a little bit what direction the public opinion seems to be going on the topic based on those different groups of people. Another project that we've had out there recently that's been fairly interesting is with members of faculty in health and human performance. We've been collecting data on the WNBA. And for them, they're very interested in whether or not social media have an effect on players. So what we're doing basically is collecting players' accounts, and we're looking at people who reply to those players' accounts. And I think there's probably 80 athletes that we're following here. And basically, they're measuring, do really negative posts, people basically attacking or directing hate speech at these players, does that affect their performance in any way? So they're looking at before and after every game. Is there a certain volume of very targeted language that's happening? So they're still processing that, so I'm waiting to see what the results are. But we spend a lot of time with our students figuring out how best to get those data and how best to reduce the noise in those data as well. We're also thinking a lot about hurricanes, right? I already mentioned Hurricane Melissa and the fact that we can really limit our scope of attention on just Jamaica and see what's happening in that space. But more broadly, we know that social media are very directly affecting the distribution of information, both before a hurricane and after a hurricane, in terms of how people are communicating evacuation efforts or preparedness efforts, but then afterwards, how are they asking for help? Or in the case of Helene and Milton, there's a lot of differing accounts of what happened and who's accountable for distribution of resources. And then the last two that we're looking at, one is just higher education as a whole. We're trying to figure out where all the winds of change are coming from, we'll put it that way, in terms of pressure on higher education right now. There's a lot of issues, of course, with young people deciding to go to college or university after high school or choose trade schools. But there's a lot of pressure coming from outside organizations and individuals to push universities to make certain kinds of changes. And so as we're thinking about where that influence is coming from, an excellent place to go, of course, is social media, because we can begin to map out and measure who's pushing certain kinds of narratives and where they're coming from. And then finally, and I love this one, is that I have students that have been very interested in TikTok. I don't know if you're aware, but we're not allowed to use TikTok on the university servers or on university computers. And that was determined several years ago that it was a security risk because TikTok is based in China. And students have been very frustrated by this because they want to study TikTok, and I keep telling them we can't, except we could probably look at it as a topic, right? And so we can go analyze those who are either implementing the ban, maybe those who are resisting the ban in different ways. And I have a couple of students that are actually going out and looking at politicians who are talking about the ban on social media, or those who have bought advertisements in the past and broadcast those on Facebook and Instagram and other social media. So they're going through and they're basically trying to determine, again, who's providing this work. What are some of the strategies that are being put into place, especially from a political communication standpoint. Now, here's my brag sheet. It's one of the last things that I'll show you today in terms of our students. So this past academic year, we've had at least 700 students. And I say at least because I can't always keep track of everybody. But this is just based on the visits and the names and the signups and the reservations that I received. So more than 700 students. And one of the best ways we get students into our lab right now is through classes. And so faculty design assignments with me. They come in wanting their students to get trained on particular skills. And so they come directly in that way. We've had 32 classes last year come in, serving 475 students. The second thing that we do, and I love these a lot, are events. So one of our most popular events is called the Brand Bowl, which you can see right here on screen. We watch the Super Bowl, but for the ads and not for the game. So we watch the ads. And we do a couple things there. One is a very classic focus group where we have 40 students that volunteer, and they watch every single ad. And I think last year it was 79 ads. And they have to do that in real time, and then they have to score those ads. So they're just providing, basic Nielsen-style ratings. Did you see an ad? What was your did you like it or not, basically. Then we have another team of about 10 students that are doing social media listening to the ads. So think of there's some really popular ones last year, like Mountain Dew had a really weird commercial last year. And students are going out looking for what does the rest of the world think about that ad, right? So they're collecting two completely different types of data and looking at how did their peers react, how did the world react, and then they're going through and essentially making a white paper that they distribute talking about global reactions. And we do other types of watch parties as well. Like this lab is very well situated for live events. Just Sunday, there was a Grand Prix Formula One race in Mexico City. I don't watch these things at all, but we had a group of students that said, we'd love to watch this in the lab because we have big screens. And I said, you can only do that if I can teach you how to analyze the social media content as well. And I'll tell you, they were deep into it, right? They were looking at, we only looked at about 90 minutes of data, and there were over 100,000 posts about this one car race. And we can see changes in sentiment. We can see unexpected things emerge. And when you think about students who are going to become broadcasters someday or going into media and management, they're thinking about, like, what things do you cover? I mean, it's a car race. They're just going around in circles, right? Like, it's a more complicated map than that. But how do you cover that in a compelling way? And so we were able to see through social media different moments where the audience is reacting in ways that you wouldn't expect. That tells them now, go cover that. Like that's an important part of the race. Get more of the drivers on air with the radio so that you can hear them talking to their teams. People love that during the race. So those are really important events. And think too, like especially during election season, anytime that there are debates. We ran some social media listening sessions during the presidential debates and vice presidential debates last year. And what we're able to see are what are the topics that people end up paying attention to. And for better or for worse, we see certain issues that we expect are going to be dominant disappear from public discourse, and new phrases or new topics emerge. And we could see those happening live during debates. And that really kind of told us that that debate, it may not have been about who won or who lost, but rather who was able to redirect attention. And we can see that and study that. Additionally, we do different types of workshops. So again, we provide extracurricular training for students on a regular basis. So students who aren't part of a class, or students who aren't part of a team that I'll mention here in a moment, are looking for ways to enhance their skills. And we just provide those pretty much every Wednesday afternoon. And so we'll teach them how to use many of the tools I showcased here today, teach them some coding, teach them some fundamental tools for accessing things like Google search trends and how to use those in their reporting. And then finally, I direct a group of interns and what we call immersion students. And for those of you who will come visit next week, I hope you'll get to meet some of those students. I'll give them a moment to showcase some of their work as well. But what I love is that these students are often those who never thought they would be interested in data. And because it's related to social media, and because it's related to their everyday life and the world around them, they suddenly find applications for it. And they suddenly find ways to learn the skills and do so in ways that just always amaze me. And so we have really three teams, one that is focused on more academic or client research. We have another that is focused on what we call trends reporting. And so in other words, they look for current events and they use our tools to go in and analyze what happened. And they try to learn how to write about that, kind of like a features writing piece. And then finally, we also have students that help organize the events like the Brand Bowl or like the Formula One race that I had mentioned a few moments ago as well. All right, so with that, I'm going to start to open it up for questions because otherwise I will get out my laptop and plug in and start to open up some of the dashboards and invite you into some of the analyses. But that's really only best done in our lab in that space. So I'd like to hear from you. What concerns, questions, and comments do you have at this point?
This is really fascinating, but I'm concerned about the data that you're using.
Oh, yeah.
And the quality of that data.
Yep.
And the extent to which the data itself is distorting your picture of what's really going on.
Absolutely.
So for example, you're focused on social media, but many people don't use social media.
Yep, exactly.
Won't even touch it.
Yep.
There are other aspects where for a particular segment of the population, it may be very important. So how are you qualitatively discerning real data? So for example, what people say is different from what they do. So I think that data that reflects what people are actually doing, what they purchase, where they go, what they're actually doing is more valid than the talk.
Right.
So how are you getting an accurate view given those limitations in the data itself?
Right. That's an awesome question because that's something that our students have to deal with on a regular basis. And so some of the first trainings that we do with students is getting them to understand what they're actually looking at, right? So that's number one, is that we basically have to tell them this is not the world, right? That's a frequent mistake that people doing this work will make, is that saying the map is the territory, is often the idiom that's used in that case. So in order to counteract that, there are several things that happen. One is that when we're doing different types of analyses, like politics is probably one of the best ones right now, we are taking into account where the data are coming from. So for example, the majority of what we'll see during a live debate is going to be coming from X, which we know at this point has particular biases, which we know at this point contains a few very loud voices, and most other people are reading it. So for us then, the project becomes not a project where we say, this is the direction the world is going, but rather, this is the role that X is taking in this moment, right? And so as we're mapping that, we're basically able to do things like to say, I'm thinking about the last set of debates as a really good example here. Why did the phrase eating cats and dogs suddenly take off? And why is everybody so focused on that, right? And we're able to then go in and to say, okay, we can find the influential accounts that really made that stick. We can now see the journalists who ended up following that and then turning that into a story because they were so focused on just this little part of X. So we start to then make recommendations that say, you missed all the other stuff that was happening, right? So it's a different way of thinking about the data. I often tell my students it's like having a Gestalt switch in your brain, because as you're watching all these other things unfold, you also have to be asking yourself, what isn't here? And so in the case of X, it would be, what were the other topics we had anticipated, and why weren't they showing up? Why weren't we talking about tax reform or healthcare or reproductive rights? And we can then go back and see, again, where those might have been either cut off, or there might be very distinctive communities talking about those in that space that we then can analyze those and to say, yeah, even though it wasn't the loudest, it was still happening. So we take into account context, we take into account platform, we take into account timing, and then we also take into account that this is supplemental. And that's, I think, the last most important one, is that very little that we do in this lab is on its own standalone research. It's usually part of a much larger study. And so it contributes to it or helps frame questions, but it's not the end-all, be-all. I hope that helps. Yeah.
Okay, question here, and then two over there.
Fascinating. I can't wait to go next week and see this in action. I'm curious about the software that you've brought in from the outside, the Talk Walker, Bandwidth, Quid, and so on. To what degree do you modify it? I mean, obviously you can put in criteria, variables, or whatever, but do you modify the code?
Oh, yeah, great question. So, do we modify the code? Some platforms allow us, others don't. So that is one of our challenges right now. So we have the most control over the query. So in other words, when we are requesting data, our results are only as good as our query itself. And so we spend a lot of time in training, particularly with students, but also with faculty, saying, what is it that we're trying to find and look for? So that's where most of the modification happens. In terms of things like the sentiment analysis, in terms of the topic or thematic analyses, even I showcased those conversation clusters. Many cases, especially if we're trying to help out with an academic study, we end up exporting those data, the raw data from those platforms, and running our own analyses, usually in R or Python or the tools that we'll use there. And so that way we can do things that are more reproducible. That way we can do, we can make our own tweaks to how like sentiment, like the positive or negative emotions are calculated. We can have our own lists applied and have, again, our control over that. So in some cases, I guess to answer your question, in some cases, yes. In many cases, we're working with an industry tool where if we need to make those changes, we have to just then export the data ourselves. Yeah, absolutely.
I was curious on how sophisticated are political parties in using your approach to like develop their platforms. So when they get on their soapbox, they're speaking and they get more bang for their buck. And if they are sophisticated, are they developing their own Atlas Lab, or do they go to you and say, can you help me with this? And if they do, are you allowed to help them?
So no, I cannot get involved in politics. I'll say that first. So to the best of my knowledge, there are several things happening at the political level. One, if you're familiar, there's a pollster named Frank Lutz who's very, very good at this work, who what they're looking at, kind of as you hinted, is messaging strategy. And so they're testing terminology. And so they're seeing, like a classic example would be, used to be global warming that everyone was concerned about. Now it's climate change. And that was essentially a switch crafted by pollsters like him to take a different direction and invest different resources in different kinds of solutions. And so that testing then happens, and again, I don't get a lot of conversation on this, but I have heard from some academics that look into political communication that they do testing through the social web. And so some good examples of that would be several years ago, there was a lot of controversy that emerged over the phrase critical race theory. And that was basically tested not in focus groups, but in online spaces. And so you had very influential Twitter accounts basically posting this idea, testing the waters and seeing if they could get people upset over that or get people defending that term. And then they would keep crafting that message and keep working with it. So it becomes an incredible testing ground. And tools like this can allow you then the ability to basically examine that at scale. So not just one person testing that, but rather if you have a network of 100 or 200 different accounts, now you have a lot more that you need to examine and study. So I'd say the best way to think about how it's being used is testing strategy and looking for basically networks of influence that can be tracked and traced. Yeah, thank you for that question.
I'm pretty horrified by some of this. I agree with the first gentleman. I'm a little concerned about the fact that the students and young people I've talked to seem to think that the social media, these people have credentials when they're talking about something. So people can lie to your face. They can lie even easier online.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one comment. The other one is when you do your work and write your report up or whatever the students are doing, is there some kind of margin of error that you report? Or you say, for example, your whole little thing about the different generations, my generation isn't even mentioned in that because I'm old. And so, I feel like my voice is not being heard.
Right.
I don't use social media because I don't trust it.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't, if I was a professor or a business person, I would not take this as the last word.
Mm-hmm.
So are the students beginning to look at this critically? Is there any critical thinking going on?
Absolutely. So let's look at it at a couple of levels. So one, I'm horrified too, right? Because every day I'm going into these spaces going, oh my gosh, what controversy is being concocted, right? What misinformation is emerging? And you have to, again, deal with that, or you have to look at that, or you have to just say this is part of that ecosystem that's been created. You can't put it back in the bottle, right? It's there, it's having an effect. So I think to your a couple of points. So one would be, so how are students kind of working with this? So one, we have to teach and train them how do you even begin to use these tools, right? And so we start in very easy spaces like popular culture, where it's less about misinformation and political influence or anything like that, but rather how are people addressing their concerns or interests or excitement in those spaces. Once they get a hang for that, that allows us to move into the next phase, which is what's missing? What are the problems? Again, like you're saying, like which voices are missing? And they can actually see that regularly. When we provide those filters, they're always astonished, like, oh, I found so many millions of posts. And then when you apply a filter, age 65 plus, all of a sudden the data go down to maybe 2 data points, right? And so that's exactly that moment where we then say, okay, how do you talk about what you've just seen, right? What's missing in this report? So it's actually less margin of error. I think that's a hard thing for us to actually test against within the data that are there, but rather context. What did you look at, right? When you created the search and the study, how many posts were coming from certain spaces? How many authors were creating content? And they've had some cases where it looks like there's a lot of discussion, a lot of data, and they realize, oh, it's 100 people posting over and over and over and over and over again. So again, in these cases, what we're using these for is not, here's the report on the social media itself, but rather, based on what we've seen, we need to make these recommendations, right? So we found misinformation, or we have found networks that are causing havoc, or we found a really interesting community of people who are supportive and uplifting of each other. I don't know, to try to put a positive spin on that. So in these cases, the data are a bit different from how I would look at very classic social science, which again is going to be involved with p-values and stats. And we're now thinking about trying to measure something that is very fleeting and intangible, but we have to do so in a way that recognizes that it's not the whole picture, it's not the whole story, it's not representative, but it's a snapshot of a particular group in a particular moment. That can help us make other types of decisions. And the reason for that, of course, is that this is a very loud space, a very disproportionately influential space, right? And I want to go back to your question, too, about representation or representativeness of data. In many cases for me, if I'm looking at something emerging on Twitter and blowing up on Twitter, I'm thinking about not, is this representative of the country? I'm thinking about what effect is that now going to have on, let's say, the stock market, or what effect is it going to have on the headlines tomorrow, because that's what powerful people are paying attention to. Yeah, exactly, exactly. So in many ways, this is, again, a tool that is helping us identify those problems in action, right? So I would never treat this as a replacement for surveys. I would look at it as a supplement. I would look at it as a way to maybe help craft some of the survey questions based on things we're already seeing. But by no means would I say this is going to replace those, right? And then the last step would be, by no means would I say, great, the AI tools doing that work are even more accurate. They're a little bit more helpful in establishing some of the broad level themes. But again, we're thinking about this as a tool to begin the process of creating those insights. So, but yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, you may have answered my question partially. Yeah, every week there's a poll on this and that, and political season there are just numerous polls. How does this matter, or has anyone done it, compared what you see in the poll of 1,000 people or fewer compared to this kind of analysis of events?
Yeah, I think it depends on the poll and the topic for sure. But I think some of the things that I would be thinking about, like again, if we're trying to tap into the political zeitgeist, so to speak, I would probably want to find ways to try to make it a little bit more representative. But again, I think what's more important is that we're measuring attempts to influence, right? So I wouldn't look at a sample of Twitter and just say, this is an accurate poll to reflect the nation. I would not do that, and I would argue against that, doing that very, very strongly. But what I might look at instead is to say, there are certain topics that are getting a lot more attention and traction in these spaces, and who's basically going to influence that, who's making that happen in these moments. I don't know, does that help answer in any way? Yeah.
I mean, we rely, or maybe we hear about polls of 1,000 people, something like that. And
Right.
here you are looking at hundreds of thousands. What's more accurate?
Right. Again, I'll say it depends on the topic. Right. So if we're doing political polling, right? If we're doing political polling, I would not rely on social media to get, again, like here's the direction of the country, right? We can't determine who's likely voters or registered voters. We can't determine who is an individual person who is a bot. We can make estimates, right? We might be able to say, here's some likelihood. But rather, what I'm looking for is this particular term is suddenly getting used a lot more now. Why is that, right? And where does that appear to be going? And being able to see then, why is that getting taken up? Like, I'm not usually taking this and saying, here's a great news story, right? Usually what I'm doing is taking that and saying, there are efforts to make this a bigger issue than it already is, right? So yeah, I would never use it for that kind of accuracy. And I don't think, I certainly hope nobody's really trying to use it for that kind of accuracy either, right? We're using it to make informed guesses, and primarily to help us inform other decisions that say, again, a term is emerging, who's making it emerge, how much traction is that getting, how loud is that, and can something be done about it, right? That's the different approach, I guess. Yep.
We have 3 questions, and then we're going to have to get out.
Yep.
Maybe this ties into all of this, but are there groups that can actually influence the topic and you not know about it? Or countries or
Yeah. All the time. I mean, and often what happens is we find out about it well after the fact, right? And so there have been several studies that have looked at, like foreign influence operations. And usually what happens is that there is like a particular phrase that is repeated over and over again, kind of like a textbook, copy and paste from that concept. And what you can essentially do is then find those that are doing that, start to collect all the other content that they're producing and look for the same similarities and patterns. But then tracing it back to a single country of origin takes a little bit more like linguistic detective work to say, oh, the way they structured that sentence appears to be something like a learner of, or a second, sorry, I'm trying to figure out the best way to phrase this, a learner of English from Russia might do, right? And that's how many of those have come about. Somebody sees something happen, they find that phrase, and they get curious about it. They say, let's trace it back to some sort of source or group and look for other indicators that might help us establish where that's coming from. Because many of them are very savvy right now. Like they don't, like if they include a location, they try to make it appear they're coming from the United States or Canada or Mexico or whatever. They try to make it appear more local than in other spaces. But yeah, that absolutely happens. And yes, we are grossly unaware of many of them. Or we're to the point that many people have just given up. In fact, there have been a number of labs that have done research on these areas, and they've either been pressured to close their doors or have just lost funding to do that kind of work.
My question is, how do you deal with censorship in the social media? Because there are certain terms which are, it's better not to use these days. For example, you said global warming, you don't use. You have to use climate change. You can't use Black Lives Matter. You can't use lots of other terms without getting into trouble. So my point is that people would not be using them. And then your data, if you were to look, you'd say, oh, people don't care about these things because nobody is talking about it. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one, I would say notions of censorship are kind of interesting right now because a lot of people, I think it's not that they're not using it, it's that when they post, often the settings or the algorithms built into platforms like Facebook or X in these cases, that if you use those terms, you're essentially blacklisted from being seen. That doesn't mean the post wasn't created. We can, again, if it's public, we can collect it. And so oftentimes we can find many of those, but they're not reinforced, right? They're not given feedback to kind of engage in those spaces. So I think the summary in that would be, can we find evidence of that suppression? So what I might measure then is, I might look for a post that uses a censored phrase and say, how many engagements did it receive? Or how many impressions, right? How many times was it seen? And collect others similarly and look for, do they have similar low levels of engagement counts? And then compare to other posts that user has created and how does it compare to their baseline? So that way I could look for evidence of a particular we call it like platform level suppression or platform level censorship. So in terms of dealing with it, like if people aren't posting a term, we won't see it, but we could measure it over time. So we could kind of look for a moment, like do we see when people stop using global warming or Black Lives Matter, and then begin to investigate to say that, is there a censorship operation taking place, or are people changing terminology, or are they self-censoring across the board in ways that might be a problem? I don't know if that helps answer, but that's how we might approach it in the lab.
I'm not sure I understand. Maybe when we come to the lab.
Absolutely, yeah.
To go back to an answer that you provided, which was that in some cases there are 100 people, only 100 people that are very noisy about this. But to what extent can you discern that it's not 100 people, it's only 95 of those are bots?
Yeah.
And they're controlled by one person or two people.
Right.
And to what extent are your students discerning that or, aware of those issues? As opposed to
Yeah.
thinking, oh, these are valid comments that are coming from real people.
Right, right. That's such a great question. So right now, I would say I don't have students that are like on that as an exact topic. But if we run across that kind of situation, so again, we're usually thinking about, are there topics where this really matters, right? Like so often politics is going to be a very good example. So if we think back to debates and people pushing certain agendas and certain phrases, we would look for a couple of things. One would be similar patterns across those users. So again, I would take that group that we just saw, and I might try to collect their last 100 posts and basically cross-reference and look for similarities. Because if they're all posting the same thing week in, week out, that's a really good indicator that's an orchestrated campaign. But if I find another one where they are very interactive and engaging with many like diverse constituencies or other users, that's usually a pretty good indicator that that is either a human actor or at least close to a human actor. You can't always know 100%, right? But what you can do is look for those indicators. The problem, though, is many of the platforms we work with don't provide like automatic bot detection. But what they do provide is what we call different types of noise filters. And so they will actually go through and look for other types of patterns of behavior that could be either abusive or indicative of like spam or other kinds of malfeasance, basically. So like an account, for example, that does nothing but tag other users. And they're just basically trying to get like a larger following is a really good example of that. And we can tell these tools to filter those out and remove those. Even if they post regular comments, we try to filter them out because they're inauthentic. And so there are definitely methods. The problem is there's never one thing that like a siren saying like here is one of those types of accounts. We have to find methods to determine that. But yeah, there are definitely ways to go and do that. And if we're doing a larger scale study that we need some level of consistency, we'll absolutely go back and cross-reference and look at those users. Or the other side of it is that's a really important finding, that there is a degree of noise, or those users are indeed inauthentic, and we can make some good educated guesses as to the extent that they are.
Thank you, Nathan. Wow, what a conversation. Busleys, 1 o'clock from the Lower Commons. We'll see you there.
Great, yep, thanks.